Okay, can we begin? Great. So welcome everybody to this event co-hosted between Nature-Finance and WWF. And we're here in the Nature Positive Pavilion partly because we're discussing the importance of this topic. How do we start to align global financial flows with nature positive outcomes in a world where these definitions are evolving? So today we have the pleasure of inviting our distinguished panelists to discuss concrete pathways for private and public financial actors to increase their alignment with nature positive outcomes. My name is Dr. Vian Sharif. I have the privilege of being here CEO of Nature Alpha and also working closely with Nature-Finance to bring their nature positive alignment tool to the market. So today we sit with around 9 months remaining until the task force on nature-related financial disclosures is implemented. And so today what we're going to discuss is both nature positive approaches and how we start to measure what nature positive could be, but also the emerging governance considerations for the implementation of the TNFD in each country and efforts by companies to adopt the TNFD recommendations. And we're very privileged to have representatives from Japan here to discuss this with us in practice. So companies and financial institutions, as I'm sure you've noticed over the last few days or weeks, are sharing their experiences, and more feedback, more and more guidelines are coming into play with regard to how this can actually work in practice. So as we all know, this will become greater in terms of impact if we all start to adopt an aligned framework for reporting. And the TNFD is absolutely out there in the forefront, leading the way on many of these initiatives. And we will also, in due course, have Emily McKenzie joining us from the TNFD as Technical Director. Now, if the G7 countries, which Japan will host and encourage to discuss next year, play an important leadership role in this regard, then our chances of success are amplified. The last thing I want to mention is that we welcome today Alexa, who will talk to us about the SEED initiative, the ETH SEED initiative at the Crowther Lab, to discuss how these innovative partnerships, this world standardized assessment measuring the biocomplexity of nature at a global scale, can help support these kinds of measurement initiative. And the object of the index, which you'll tell us a little bit more about, Alexa, is to crystallize a truer value of nature into the economy and to shape the standards that underpin the rigorous governance of markets and regulatory disclosures. So it just remains for me now to introduce our panelists. And also to encourage you all to think about the initiatives that you're seeing around you in this pavilion, including the incredible work of IUCN, of WWF. There have been incredible convenings in this space around how the finance sector can engage on the concept of nature positive and how we actually realize this in a set of tools. So, privileged to introduce you today, Margaret Kulo, the Global Financial Practice Leader at WWF International, Jeremy Eppel, Principal at Nature-Finance. Emily McKenzie will be joining us later from the TNFD. Ms. Hamashima, Director of the Office of Mainstreaming Biodiversity at the Ministry of the Environment in Japan. Mr. Harada, Member of the Board of Directors at the Development Bank of Japan, or the DBJ. And Alexa Firmenich, Co-Director of the SEED Biocomplexity Index at the Crowther Lab. Margaret, we'll start with you. So there are a number of new tools and solutions. We've talked about the work coming out of IUCN, the discussion coming out around a number of different frameworks from science-based targets for nature through to the TNFD. Can we talk a little bit about the new tools and solutions that are out there to increase the alignment of public and private financial flows with nature? Tell us, what are the current challenges, do you think, preventing an integrated approach to the alignment of finance with both nature positive but also net zero goals?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, and thanks to Nature-Finance for organizing this discussion. Very good topic, very timely in the context of the discussions happening here in Montreal. And I want to open by framing 4 key challenges. First, the need for clear political signals. Second, the need for clear economic signals. Third, the need for shared language. And fourth, I'm going to unfairly put data metrics tools all in one bucket, although I know that others on the panel will break that up. So first, with respect to clear political signals, one of the things we really need to get out of the global biodiversity framework and out of the conversations happening on the 5th floor and around the building this week is a clear political signal on where the world needs to go directionally on the environment. That clear political signal should include an ambitious mission to achieve a nature-positive world by halting and reversing nature loss so that we're restorative by 2030. It needs to scale conservation and restoration, including through a more ambitious and inclusive conservation and restoration of at least 30% of land and sea and inland waters. It needs to tackle our footprint. We need to tread a little bit more lightly or a lot more lightly on the earth through a transformative and inclusive approach to delivering a just transition in the productive sectors that are driving nature loss, including, I think, primarily the food sector. It needs to include a strong implementation mechanism or this ambitious framework won't be delivered. It needs to ratchet up action to ensure over time that the agreement is delivered. And last, it needs to be resourced. We need the finance to deliver the ambition. And I want to talk a little bit more, moving from that clear political signal to the clear economic signal, specifically to get to that point on alignment. So we've been able to, there are a couple of really good reports that have come out, one from the UNEP Finance Initiative last week or the week before, identifying the gaps in finance for biodiversity, and also identifying ways we might fill those gaps. And you might think about that as how we align. So not just making sure that we have less finance driven toward things that harm nature, but more finance towards things that support nature. And we have some experience in alignment with respect to the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement. And that climate example is a good one in that Paris Agreement set a clear political signal and a clear alignment signal that now the sector has been able to follow. There are a lot of reasons why it's not an entirely one-to-one parallel, but it's an excellent example, and there are things that we can learn from the alignment tools for climate to transfer into how we align for the environment, including by making sure we're paying attention to both sides of the ledger, if you will. So decreasing the flows of funds to the bad things and increasing the flows of funds to the good things. And we've got some good examples in the network for greening the financial system. The central banks are now helping send that clearer signal through the financial sector on climate. And now there's a biodiversity-related task force in the central banks and financial regulators looking also at how they might send clearer signals with respect to the financial systems risks that come from biodiversity loss. Now, the third, shared language. We are really facing an interdisciplinary, complex challenge in addressing nature loss. And all of us, including probably all of us here on the stage, speak a different language with respect to that problem. We sometimes use different words to mean the same thing, we use the same words to mean different things, and we need to be a lot more purposeful in the way we speak about what we intend to get, both from the CBD conversations and then how it gets implemented through the economy afterwards, in order to make the change that needs to happen. And there are lots of efforts, taxonomies, the TNFD, you might say, the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, really trying to make an effort to bring shared language to these conversations. But we all need to listen very carefully in these discussions to make sure we really are understanding those conversations, because there's a really big difference in the way a central banker refers to these issues and the way a conservation biologist refers to this issue, and that doesn't mean that there's disagreement. So I think that shared language is really a big challenge, and I've been excited to see all the efforts to address it. And then the last is this data, metrics, and tools. And we have, again, the opportunity in climate to look at some of the tools that have been developed. For example, the Science-Based Targets Initiative has an alignment tool available for financial institutions that also has data that sits on a Bloomberg terminal. For those of you who work in finance, that's fabulous. For those of you who don't, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But it's a really important thing because that gets the information directly to the people who are making decisions on that information. And I think the disclosure also, I would consider disclosure a tool. It is a mechanism to get to the outcome we're looking for. And the faster we can get a good framework, and then the faster the regulators can pick it up to make disclosure mandatory, the faster you can get better quality information and more information in order to drive the decision making to align. So with that, I'll turn back to you, Jan.
Margaret, a fantastic synthesis of all the elements that we all have to contend with in this room. We are all translators, but this sense that there is a nature-positive apex target has been seen to be effective in some ways in convening effort in the climate space. Can it do the same in nature? And I'm going to now hand to Jeremy. Perhaps, Jeremy, you could share a little bit more about the nature positive or the nature alignment tool that you've been developing very hard in terms of very hard work at Nature-Finance.
Thanks. Is this on? Can you hear that? Yeah. Thanks very, very much, Vian. We can't hear ourselves speak, so that's good. Can you hear? Oh, that's better. Okay, fine. Much better. Yes, thank you for that terrific introduction, Margaret and Vian, setting the scene, because I think what we've tried to develop in the last few months, and it's been a pretty short haul in, it's all right, I'm coming for it, in Nature-Finance with a lot of partners and collaborators, many of whom I think are in this room, but I am going to stand up and just show you a few slides. And if I don't stand up, I can't see what I'm showing. So I've decided to come around here to do it. Otherwise, there'll be, I'll be looking without eyes in the back of my head. It would be difficult. So let me just make sure I can go back on this. Okay. What we actually have is a tool that we've developed in Nature-Finance over the last few months, which is intended to look explicitly at financial flows from the perspective of nature and alignment. There are a multitude of metrics, many of them very, very good out there at the moment for looking at risk and impact. But there isn't at the moment a specific metric which looks at the alignment issue from the finance sector's perspective. So we see this as, we hope, a first of its kind to try and get the ball rolling, to try and get the discussion and the analysis started, and to work with as many partners as possible for that effort. So I'm afraid the slides are out of order, and I will go on because I think this is slightly come in the wrong place. So what we have done is to take a great deal of data, public and private financial flows, into a model that we have designed, and I will briefly describe it to you, and there'll be much more information available, including on our website, which has attempted to gather as much private financial data and public financial data as we have been able to access, and then to assess that data against two sets of norms. First of all, country impacts, and secondly, sectoral impacts. And so this is, if you like, an exercise in averaging the nature of those flows and the effects of those flows. And we have then combined the assessments that we have used, and for the sector assessment, we have used the alternatives available. We've used both SBTN and Encore. And for the country assessments, we have used a bespoke framework which looks at ecosystem intensity, the way in which natural resources are used, and the regulatory framework. So a composite that looks at the nature receiving environment, or the biodiversity receiving environment, if you like, of the country. And then this produces, through our model, an index score on the dashboard on the dial that you see on the right, from 0 to 10, as simple as that. We have, to date, captured something like $31 trillion worth of financial flows. There are something like $100 trillion of financial flows in total annually, and we've captured about 30% of them so far. And it's a very aggregate score, and I'm sure these numbers will be wrong, and when we do further work, they'll be refined, but the result that comes out is a score of 6.4. So average alignment. But if you look at those flows which have a score above 8.5, so 8.5 to 10 on this dial, only 13% of those flows are highly aligned, meaning all the rest of the flows are either averagely aligned or poorly aligned, which I think is a very worrying story. And if you look at the private sector, where we have about 3 trillion worth of data at this stage, we want to gather a lot more through working with private institutions. The figures are about the same, but it's not a great story. Public expenditure, where the bulk of the data is, because that's the most readily accessible, the score is roughly similar. Development finance, the work of the development finance institutions, public development banks, it looks worse. It's not necessarily worse. We have less data. We have all the data that's available on development finance from the DAC database, but it is much more granular, so we can make a closer assessment. But you get the idea. In the terms of order of magnitude, there isn't a lot of global finance that is, at the moment, highly aligned with nature. And if the Global Biodiversity Framework has as one of its goals in Goal D and in the related mainstreaming targets, alignment of financial flows, clearly there is a lot of work to do. So we hope that this tool can help us understand that better. So we will gather more data, we'll have a series of pilots, and we will develop the tool further. But importantly, and I want to stress this point, nearly everybody on this panel, in one way or another, has something to play, a part to play in helping us refine this so that it is as useful as possible. It is designed explicitly so that reporting out of this index can be fed into the TNFD LEAP reporting framework. It was designed with that in mind. It very much reflects the kind of excellent data that Alexa and the SEED partnership are doing, in which she was talking about earlier, where the partnership which Nature-Finance is building with SEED and the Crowther Lab will, I think, be integral to how we do this. And the kind of things you talked about, Margaret, what's already happening to deliver data right to the heart of the financial sector through Bloomberg, sounds a very interesting thing that we ought to talk about how we can merge those two. So already I'm feeling encouraged by the kind of partnerships we can think about. So thank you very much. It's the first shot, work in progress. We intend to develop it a lot further quite quickly. Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And currently you're looking for people to partake in pilots to enhance the sort of data that you're able to access. Is that right?
We are certainly interested in hearing from those from private financial institutions and public development banks and governments about their appetite for being part of a small pilot program. So yes, definitely let us know if that would be of interest. And there's more information about what those would involve, fairly light touch, on our website.
Thanks, Jeremy. And we're really privileged at Nature Alpha to work with you on bringing that to market. So thank you. Emily, welcome. One of the busiest people in this whole conference centre, I think. So a real pleasure to have you with us. Thank you, as Technical Director of the TNFD. So Emily, the question that we're wanting to hear your views on is the TNFD and the framework. How do you see that in terms of its role in supporting nature-positive outcomes, and how can something like the tool that Nature-Finance is developing support that for you?
Thank you very much, Bian, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel and also to have contributed on the journey of developing the tool. We've had numerous conversations of you been developing it, and I have to say, when you first had the idea, it wasn't that long ago, and I wasn't sure you could pull it off. It's a bit like the TNFD framework, but you've pulled off a miracle, and I know that the miracle will continue to develop. So it's all credit. It's amazing to see what you've done. So yeah, I work in the secretariat that supports the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which is a market-led initiative to develop a risk management and disclosure framework. You may have heard about it in other sessions already this week. And really, as I thought about this word alignment and I looked again at our mission of the task force, it's really all about alignment, I suddenly realized. We never use that term, but it's all about alignment. The mission of the task force is develop a risk management and disclosure framework, but the ultimate goal of doing that is to significantly shift global financial flows away from activities that harm nature and towards those that enable nature to thrive. And that is what alignment is. I mean, we have to crystallize exactly what the targets will be. So the Global Biodiversity Framework being negotiated these weeks will be critical. We also need to understand the science. So the task force is also tracking the work of scientists like the Earth Commission, which is looking at planetary boundaries and updating its thinking on planetary boundaries. So we look at these North Stars of what the targets should be, just like I know you're thinking about for the alignment tool, and we'll be updating that also, the work of the Science-Based Targets Network. This important work on what the targets should be from global to national to local scales sets the North Stars for us at every level. So we will be also looking at that as you are doing in the alignment tool. I also was looking at your results and thinking, how do we complement each other? So my bottom line is I think the TNFD framework and the alignment tool that Nature-Finance has developed are highly complementary. I think what you are showing with the index and the dashboard is the challenge ahead. And it actually reminds me of work I did in a previous role where I worked on something you might be familiar with, the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. And one of the visuals, we love doing the visuals for that. We looked at the size of finance that was harmful for nature in both the private and the public sector, the tremendously large amount of perverse subsidies that are going into activities that harm nature. And then we looked at all the great research that's done that's trying to estimate how big the size of nature is that's going into restoration and conservation. And we couldn't get the scales to be big enough. I mean, it's, you know, one size was so much bigger than the other, highly weighting it down. And with your 6%, your 30%, you know, as you said, they may not be right. You'll improve these data over time, but it's showing the size of the challenge. And so you're showing the size of the challenge. You're showing what needs to be done by all aspects of the finance system. And we're complementing that by creating a risk management and disclosure framework, which I love the way you put it, as a tool. Margaret. So we're creating a tool that will help organizations, corporates and financial institutions, and we hope to go wider than that. We had an exciting session this morning with public development banks and development finance institutions, so even in the public sector, to be shifting that finance.
Emily, thank you so much. And I came from a session this morning hosted by the TNFD, the Data Catalyst, which is bringing together some of the actors who will hopefully be able to solve these challenges in the context of this discussion and broadly the disclosure discussion. So very much keeping our eyes on how we can support the TNFD as it evolves. Now let's turn to how we actually implement this. And we're very lucky to have in the room with us today our friends who can help describe what's actually happening in country around this kind of initiative. So Ms. Hamashima, it would be great to hear from you a little about how Japan has progressed towards its corporate disclosure on nature. Tell us, what kind of private sector support are you seeing, and is that generating any interesting opportunities for you, given your leadership in this space?
Thank you very much for having me today, and thank you very much for the great question, Bian. And this is Naoka Hamashima from Japan. And as regarding your question, in general, Japanese companies have long made progress in terms of the information disclosure in general, and through environmental reports. I'm not saying this just because I can see many faces of my friends from Japanese companies. Yeah, that's true. And however, in terms of scientific or quantitative analysis on biodiversity or nature, I must say most of the companies still have a long way to go in Japan. And so as a policymaker, I'm explaining to companies why it's necessary to now to allocate funds to biodiversity or nature and to disclose information on, as a basis on this. And one example of explanation is stranded assets theory, which is very close to what Margaret said. And so in the area of climate change, the Paris Agreement created a clear constraint to the limit temperature to within 2 degrees centigrade. And then, so the amount of fossil fuels that is buried but should not be burned became very clear. So this meant that the investment on this part of the fossil fuels should be a stranded asset. So to avoid this, the TCFD was established, as I understand. And the same is true for biodiversity. So I mean, the global goal of Nature Positive is now established here in Montreal, and at least G7 countries already agreed to it. And so this means that the investment that makes nature negative would be a stranded asset. So this is explanation what I'm making to the company in Japan, and why financial sector believe that a mechanism like TNFD is necessary. And as for your question of the second part, the support for the private sector, Japan has a tool named Regional Economic Cycle Analysis. And which was jointly developed by the Ministry of Environment and then subsidiary consulting company of DBJ. And this tool visualized the flow of funds within each municipalities in relation with economic activities using an input-output table. And for instance, a city named Kuji in Iwate Prefecture in Japan used this tool and found that the money that was leaked, the leakage of the money as an energy bill is far larger than the money that can be gained from, for example, the expansion of tourism. So this is why they decided to stop the leakage first, and they established the local energy company. So what I want to say is that thus analytical tools enables us, maybe including the one you developed this time, enables us objective and data-driven choices.
Thank you for that, and interesting to hear how that actually works in practice to shift behaviors. And so as Emily was saying, just understanding where the flow of money is going today is a crucial part of understanding how we need to perhaps redirect it and what that really means in practice for corporate activity. So thank you so much for that. Mr. Harada, may I invite you to share a few of your insights with us, specifically on how the Development Bank of Japan is working with both the public and the private sectors to support their delivery of nature-positive net zero pathways in various regions.
Thank you very much. I'm Harada. I'm from DBJ, and I'm very delighted to be here, the panelist, and talking in front of you. Can I show a slide? So first, let me introduce DBJ, because DBJ is a domestic development bank, so you may haven't heard much of DBJ. So DBJ was established in 1951 as a special public corporation and played various roles in tune with the times. Those policy objectives include industrial development and regional development and community development and so on. And DBJ has worked with various stakeholders, such as global companies, local companies, and the regional financial institutions, and central and local governments, and solved extensive economic and social problems with them. And DBJ turned into 100% owned, government-owned joint stock companies in 2008, and in preparation for a full-scale privatization at some point in the future. So, but the feature of DBJ hasn't changed a little. So I just wrote down here four core corporate values: a long-term perspective, impartiality, and public-mindedness and reliability. So these values have been passed down the generations and laid the foundation of DBJ staff's mindset. So through those activities, DBJ has earned a lot of trust from various stakeholders. I think that puts DBJ in a really unique position in Japan. It is uniquely positioned in all regions of Japan and in the both public and private sector. So I give you, here I give you 3 examples how DBJ works with various stakeholders to build momentum to transition to a nature positive and a carbon neutral economy. The first arrow said that engaging with local companies and governments. So DBJ has a nationwide network of branches and representative offices you can see from north and south. And I'd like to underline that DBJ activities are deeply rooted in each region. And DBJ's tight knot and long-lasting relationships with local companies or borrowers and governments on the ground enable deep engagement with them and help whole of region transition to a carbon neutral and nature positive economy. So I can give an example of what the DBJ is trying to do. It is an example in a city in Ehime in the western part of the prefecture. In that city, carbon-heavy paper manufacturers concentrate and emit lots of CO2s, and the decarbonization of the whole region is quite challenging. So under the leadership of DBJ, a council was set up. It is called the Carbon Neutrality Council, was set up with those paper manufacturers and the regional banks and the local governments. The DBJ serves as a secretariat of this council. And then what DBJ is doing is to assist them to draw up a roadmap for carbon neutrality by 2050 in the region as a whole. So I think this kind of approach to decarbonization could be deployed or rolled out to biodiversity issues as well in this region and in other regions. As the TNFD reporting framework says, the dependencies and impacts on nature are often location specific. Then location matters greatly for identification, assessment, avoidance and mitigation and management of risks, nature-related risks facing companies. And for this reason, efforts on biodiversity issues in each location must be conformable to the characteristics of nature in each location. So the fact that DBJ has this kind of local network gives us a great advantage. The second point, the second arrow, providing knowledge to regional banks. So DBJ introduced regional banks' recent developments in climate change and biodiversity issues. And I think local companies play a great role in these issues, and enhancing the awareness is quite important to transition to a nature-positive economy in Japan as a whole. So in this, regional banks finance local companies and provide advices to advise to regional companies and to enhance their business strategies. And for this reason, it is crucial to keep regional companies informed of ever-changing biodiversity issues that affect management of their companies, of their businesses. And so that regional banks can sufficiently fulfill advisory functions or enlightening functions. So DBJ provides knowledge on these issues to regional banks, and including, say, hosting workshops targeted at regional banks, tailored to the needs of each regional bank. And the third arrow is the contributing to policy making, such as the Ministry of Environment doing. As a public development bank, DBJ aims to balance economic and social value against the background of such behavioral principle and its proximity to the government. DBJ and its staff are often asked to participate in councils managed by, say, the Ministry of Environment. And the DBJ staff provide expert knowledge from financial standpoints to those government councils to contribute to formulating carbon neutral and nature positive policies. So now let me wrap up my talk. What DBJ is doing, coordinating various stakeholders to move them onto a nature positive and carbon neutral economy. I think there is an African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So there is a long way to go before we reach a carbon neutral and nature positive economy. And DBJ would really like to go far together with various stakeholders. Thank you.
Mr. Arada, thank you so much. Very well said. And also, it points to a very important component of all of our own experiences, I imagine, which is that whilst we all sit together here at COP15, we sit in a nature positive pavilion, actually many of the constituents with whom we're engaging are not as far along this journey as we are. There is a capacity building job for all of us to do in explaining what biodiversity and nature is, how it's important to the individuals or the institutions that we're working with. And the example here that you've given, Mr. Rad, is hugely exemplary because it's such an important component of closing the gap between understanding, implementation, and then the outcome we're all, as a collective, trying to achieve. So thank you so much for illustrating that. Alexa, on to you. You will tell us, I hope, a little about the SEED tool and the index, because it's this kind of scientific information that can really help inform the decision-making that we're going to start to see in demand from institutions like public and private finance institutions. Could I ask you to share a bit more?
Hello, hello? Yeah. Is it good? Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for being here. It's really good to see friends and partners also in the crowd. So as we've been discussing here today, alignment, measurement, even basic language around biodiversity is something that is sorely lacking. And unless we can even begin to measure and understand what biodiversity is, scientifically, technically, it's going to be incredibly hard to send the flows that are needed to communities, through different institutions, and also to penalize the kinds of behaviors and subsidies that have been referred to here. And so at the Crowther Lab, I'm co-directing SEED, which is an initiative which is creating the world's first globally standardized assessment of biodiversity for any pixel on the planet that integrates not just above ground biodiversity, but below ground and functional traits, and a whole series of different architectures of an ecosystem that are actually necessary for nature to thrive. And the reason why that matters is because if we build entire markets and new systems around faulty metrics, I think that we can begin to optimize for the wrong kinds of outcomes, as we've seen historically. And so our contribution to this initiative that everyone is here for in SEED is to offer a tool that anyone can use, whether it's TNFD, a corporation, a government, an asset manager, a community that's trying to issue a credit, to be able to rapidly and easily measure biodiversity and use that to steer capital where it needs to go. If there's one thing that I would love for everyone to take away from this talk, it's this word complexity. Again, back to language. We're calling SEED a measure of biocomplexity, because the value of nature doesn't lie in one ecosystem service that we operate for, optimize for, or carbon, or pollination, or the multiple things. The value of nature lies in this complex structure that is obviously going to be impossible to fully measure, right? Like, what we're doing is the best approximation that we have today. And Jeremy, I think, similar to your tool, we're going to keep updating this with the partnerships we form, with new information that's coming in. So what you're seeing today is a version 1 of this tool whose intention is to capture that complexity. So, as we've discussed, there's this $1 trillion opportunity, and there is a serious lack of tools to rigorously measure and quantify what biodiversity is, to monitor that change over time, and therefore to compensate for the uplift. There's a few things that we're solving for with SEED that I've touched on, but a lot of the current measures of biodiversity are quite simplistic. They focus on a few measures which are fantastic, but I think we can go a little bit further. They're static, they're relatively historic over time, and they can be quite expensive to gather. So the ground truthing is essential to the work we'll do. We're not going to do the ground truthing, but we need to combine that ground truthing with a rapid footprint that's coming from some of the global data layers that we're pulling together. And essentially what we're solving for is a paradigm that simplifies nature. And so speaking about complexity, measuring complexity, putting that into decision making, raising the standards is what we're really, really excited to be doing. And this is just a sort of diagram to show that when we think of biodiversity, it's not these individual components, it's this structure and this web that is the emergent phenomenon of lots of species interacting and coming together. And so what we're doing with SEED is we're compiling hundreds of different global data layers on things like connectivity, species, functional traits, phylogenetic, food web structures, and we're compressing them into an index that's basically also combining remote sensing satellite layers to detect changes over time, to create a 0 to 1 rating or index of biocomplexity for any pixel on the planet, with 0 being a tarmac or parking lot and 1 being the closest natural ecosystem in a natural state. So you might get a rating of 0.98, for example, if you're this lucky jungle. And then what we can do over time is benchmark according to sites in the region that are using similar different land management approaches and monitor the regenerative uplift of that asset or of that ecosystem in that place. An example of what this could actually look like, you know, this is obviously just a mock-up, but essentially we can track the complexity of that natural ecosystem. We can ingest the ground truth data from partners, some of which are who in this room. We can benchmark your performance across a sector, across land use, and do relational analytics with things like risk and other data sets. I think that's mostly it. I don't really need to speak about the market use cases because I think a lot of people here in the room grasp that. But essentially for this, we also think that there's a lot of advantages to this approach. It's not the only game out there, but we think it's a really important game that fits into a stack of approaches like the ones that you guys are pulling together to say, okay, well, how does this feed into risk, materiality, dependency, so on and so forth. And what's really interesting about SEED is we begin to illuminate invisible parts of ecosystems that haven't yet been captured. And so we make the invisible visible and material in decision making, which I think is super, super exciting. And in terms of Nature-Finance, you know, governance and deployment of such an index is going to be critical in how it actually hits the ground and how it affects communities and how wealth is distributed. And so we're really excited to be formally partnering with Nature-Finance, with the alignment tool, to think through the more difficult social aspects of how we architecture this tool in such a way that we lead to the best outcomes on the ground. So that is it from me, I think, unless there's a slide I forgot. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Alexa, thank you. So wrapping up what we've heard so far, it's been extraordinary to see the level of insight that we can capture, and we know that other players in the space are helping to create the architecture that can knit together the insights that you're bringing together, that the positive alignment, the nature alignment tool is bringing together, and start to shape that into use cases that are user-friendly, whether you are a public finance institution, whether you are an investment manager looking at a portfolio of 2,000 or 12,000 companies. These are the sorts of tech challenges that will come together with this sort of insight to bring this to market. So we're very excited to see how this all evolves. Now, I'm going to invite you, Ms. Hamashima, to give us a closing comment for the panel before we open to questions from you, our audience. And it really looks ahead to next year. Japan is the G7 host country next year. And so, wow, it's not a fire alarm, which is good. Right. So as the G7 host country next year, what kind of outputs do you expect for Japan's nature positive economy roadmap in terms of information disclosure? Anything you'd like to share with us?
Thank you very much. I appreciate that I can grab a microphone twice in the session. And yes, yeah, Japan will chair next G7 next spring. And at least we, the Minister of Environment, want to take this opportunity as an to further highlight the importance of information disclosure like TNFD, and also the importance of opportunity side of for business sector through biodiversity conservation. I mean the regarding the risk side, I think it is a financial institutions' core business, I think. I mean, the financial institutions will do their jobs as a very core business. as regarding the risk management. And so with which information analysis tool like Dr. launched today will be very helpful. But for on the other hand, for the aspect of the opportunity side, I think financial institutions need to have courage or awareness on biodiversity or nature to invest on such activities. So I think we need to do something to promote the creation of business opportunities through biodiversity conservation activities. And for example, we began to certify OECMs as a trial basis in Japan. And what we found from this trial so far is OECMs can be a treasure house of business opportunities. So I like to drive biodiversity conservation efforts, both from risk side and the opportunity side, such as OECM conservation. And regarding with regard to the nature positive roadmap, I hope that the nature positive roadmap will also help to create business opportunities that can be help nature positive.
Thank you so much. And what's become clear is that though the discussions that are taking place in this conference center over the next week or so are crucial, the public and private sector are also absolutely moving forward because of a willingness to engage on this topic. And it sounds like there's a momentum that is really unstoppable. So congratulations to all of you. Could I now invite the audience to ask any questions they would like? Do raise your hand if you have a question. There we go, sir. Could we get a mic to our colleague in the audience, please? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful discussion. My name is Naoko Ishii. That used to be I work for the GEF, currently at the University of Tokyo. My question for the panel is that how we can really create this movement from nature as a cost to as a nature as an investment or the opportunities. Ms. Hamashima actually touched upon a little bit about it, but I really would like to see that what are the tricks that we can create to shift this mindset from risk towards investment and the opportunities. We are doing too much of maybe too many of fragmented projects here and there. How we can really bring from individual fragmented projects towards more like a product or a new asset class of the nature. What are the tricks to make it work? So rather than stranded asset, but more like the new class of that investment, nature asset class. So that's something I would like to hear from the panel.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Ms. Hamashima to comment, but also I'd like perhaps Jeremy to reflect on that and maybe Mark to say a few words too.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Ishii, or Dr. Ishii. As for the, what can make the nature conservation from risk to opportunity? And I think one is the technical solution. And then, because, as I mentioned in my session before, I think that business opportunity can, if it isn't just a matter of risk, I think that business sector, people in the business sector cannot be driven to do that. But if it isn't, they have a business opportunity, it can be they can be driven by the new side. And so my solution is that I'm going to make an technical matching between the venture startup and big company. And if we create some technical solution for biodiversity conservation, I can make the change in the tide to toward the nature-based solution.
Thank you. Jeremy, perhaps a few reflections from you, especially given the work that Nature-Finance has done on markets evolving in the nature space. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Vianne, and thank you, Noko, nice to see you, for the question. I think I want to broaden it a little bit beyond conservation markets because, you know, I think, Noko, you talked about the opportunities in protected areas and so on. I think those are very real. We all need to see a lot more investment going directly into biodiversity. But what our alignment tool was looking at, and what I think is important in the way we frame our thinking about the question, is that it's much broader than just a question of biodiversity conservation or even nature conservation more broadly. I think it has to be about where nature meets markets. And so in that context, I think it is very relevant what you mentioned, Vianne. There is this task force on nature markets that we've been supporting, which has very recently produced a report that shows quite how huge those markets already are if you think about soft commodity markets, as well as other kinds of nature markets, intrinsic ones, and ones where the financial sector is starting to find new mechanisms, new instruments. So these are already huge. And I think the opportunities arise in making sure that those markets are developed in a way that is both very positive for nature, and that requires very good governance of those markets. So I think the key thing, to answer your question, is that we have to broaden our frame of reference beyond conservation, important though that is. And I think in the CBD context, in the GBF context, that means broadening our frame of reference beyond resource mobilization to alignment. And only by realigning huge flows, which are at the moment mostly nothing to do with nature, and capturing some of the nature benefits, and indeed the climate benefits of those, can we see significant resources shifting in the right direction. But it's got to be done well. And we've seen in the carbon markets that it's not always done well. So we really need to see in the nature markets a very, very effective governance process. And that's something I think we're very keen to support.
Great. And for the audience, the Nature-Finance website and the Task Force for Nature Markets website contains all of these reports, these insights, very easily accessible, a great, great read. And also, as we become advocates for this in our space, we can share these resources with others to better inform and capacity build as an offering. Margaret, a few final words from you on that question.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Naoko, for the great question, and also for all the work that you have done throughout your entire career to move this shift. I think those seeds really are starting to grow. We've seen a huge shift in the last 4 years, and I really think it's driven by the relationship between nature and climate in finance. Because whereas we started the climate discussion around stranded assets, the reason financial institutions are really moving now at faster pace is because they see the physical risks of climate, and they see, for those who are on the front end of this, the opportunity to invest in the mitigation opportunities, in the adaptation opportunities, in the resilience opportunities that have feedback into the economy. The question is that going to move as fast as we need it to move in order to really make the change?
Thank you, Margaret. We have time for a couple more questions. Audience. Hand went straight up back there. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. I'm Stephanie. I'm working for a taste and fragrance company, and here as well representing One Planet Business for Biodiversity, which is a business coalition focusing on REGAG, regenerative agricultural practices, sorry. I have a question for a bit the panelists, but as well an observation from the first responses that were provided. We need investment and the financial flow to reach our value chain. It's not only about conserving and protecting undamaged ecosystem. It's also to have these financial flows reaching our value chain so that we can halt, but we can start to regenerate. And I think this is a key element, and I was not sure through the presentation how this is taken into consideration, because it's not financial flow outside of the value chain. It really needs to reach the value chain.
Can you help us understand what your value chain is in practical terms?
Would be. A value chain is from a company when you buy natural-based ingredients, so it can be fresh flowers, gums out of resins, your crops that you have in your cereals. It's everything that comes from nature. It's our value chain. So we buy natural-based ingredients, we process them, and you as a consumer, you have it in your daily activity. So my point here is the financial flow you're talking about, the money that you have counted, let's say, around, they need to reach a transformative change in the way we are growing these materials. Do you get my point?
Yeah. I think so. Emily, I was going to come to you, absolutely. Do we have a microphone? Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I've lost the... Oh, there's the speaker, so I can make eye contact. I think I saw this also in the Nature Alignment tool. In the TNFD framework, we're looking both at direct operations, but also upstream and downstream in the value chain. And the way we think about this conceptually is thinking about impacts and dependencies on nature. And obviously, this is, it depends, but a huge amount of those happen upstream in a value chain. The example you gave is one of those. Those same ingredients you're sourcing, that could be sustainable sourcing, it could be unsustainably sourced, right? So it gets to that level of granularity of understanding the management practices, sustainable use upstream, and also all the way through to downstream. And it's actually something the task force is going to be wrestling with in its final sprint, the last release. We're thinking about principles for thinking about across value chains, because actually, and I was listening to you on a panel and taking detailed notes about how we can do this, because for many organizations, going beyond direct operations to the equivalent of Scope 3 for climate, for upstream and downstream, is overwhelming. It seems too much to do. So we, through things like the data catalyst, looking at analytical methods to shortcut that, to help with that, but also looking at principles we could use to apply across the framework and then apply for specific sectors to make it work in practice, because we know that all of this has to apply across the value chain, but it can become increasingly complex as you do so. So we'd love to learn from you in thinking that through.
Thank you, Emily, and I think we're all learning from each other, so the more collaboration we can have, the absolute better. Now, one last question from Simon Zadek, and then we'll close. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks very much. Great session. I wanted to ask about equity and rights. And it's easy to talk about equity and rights, but it's really hard to bake them in to the way markets actually function. Yeah, and I'm keen to understand, given that we're at a moment where we're trying to shape an entire new generation of markets, where nature is monetized and traded, so nature markets, how we can think through a design lens about ways in which those markets can evolve to embed principles and practices of equity and rights. And I know, Emily, the TNFD team has really struggled with this and tried to figure out where to go with this. So it would be really interesting to hear how you're trying to fit it into a sort of nature-related risk frame. But I'm sure there are many actors, including policy actors, such as thinking about the G7, where the issue of rights and equity in the context of nature-positive markets needs to be thought through quite carefully. Thank you.
Emily, would you like to reflect, and then perhaps I might invite Margaret, do you have something to close with?
Great. Yeah, it's a big question and hard to do briefly. But the task force recently published a discussion paper looking at societal dimensions of nature-related risk management and disclosure, which lays this out in more detail, and identified four chunky themes, one of which is around human and environmental rights, another around the stewardship role of and traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities, which we have strong evidence to show how effective that is. The other is around access and benefit sharing, so all of the work around the Nagoya Protocol, and finally around an equitable and just transition. So we will be working further to weave this into thinking as it relates to a nature-related risk management and disclosure framework. Obviously, these are big themes beyond us. And on rights specifically, a concrete next step that we will be taking is to look at, so woven throughout the TNFD framework is the importance of stakeholder engagement. It can't solve everything, but there are, through this landscape assessment we did, it was very encouraging to identify things that are out there, the UN guiding principles, the OECD guidelines for multinationals, that we can anchor in for the TNFD framework to build on what is credible and out there, to recognize the importance of these things. Also signposting to the very exciting development of the recognition of a healthy and safe and environment as a universal right. So we've done a first landscape assessment, starting to weave it in and continuing to think about how this is relevant to what we're doing, and welcome further feedback on how to do that.
Thank you, Emily. And perhaps a final comment from you, Margaret, before we close.
The only thing I would add to that is, and it links back to both of the other questions as well, I think one of the challenges in finance and the conversation that is happening right now is how you get money to the stewards of nature. Because there are lots of ways to get it across the top of the system, maybe to the national level, maybe even the subnational, and getting that last mile is really, really difficult. And I think if we really start from local and come up, rather than starting from the top down, it illuminates a lot of other opportunities. So I think the conversations should always start in the place with the people who are living with and responsible for stewarding the resources in the place.
Thank you. And so we've heard from an extraordinary group of people who are working in different areas, who collectively are empowering us to be able to make the changes that we need in our own sectors. So it remains for me only to say a great big thank you to all of you and to the audience for your attention and questions. Thank you.